Today we're going to talk about a very different question. It's about Reform Judaism. Now, as you may know, Judaism developed a reform wing at the beginning of the 19th century. It loosened the restrictions of halakha, had men and women sit together, used an organ, which was, of course, the Christian symbol, and denied that the Jews were a nation, they were only a religion. Please listen carefully here. The synagogue I don't go to is an Orthodox one. That is a famous Israeli quip, meaning if I would go to a synagogue, it would be an Orthodox one. I don't go to the synagogue, but orthodoxy somehow is the basis. Orthodoxy in Israel is the residual category, the default reading for Israeli Jews. It is the reference point that Israeli Jews have to religion. And I mean even secular Jews. It is orthodoxy that they don't believe in. If you want to be a little dialectical, you can say that when a Muslim and a Jew meet and say, I don't believe anymore, so we're the same, the Jew or the Muslim will answer, no, we're not the same. I don't believe in Islam, you don't believe in Judaism. It's not quite the same thing. Here it is precisely, I don't believe in orthodoxy, but if I wanted to be a religious Jew, it would be as an Orthodox Jew. It is the common denominator, the primal identity of the great majority of Israeli Jews. This is very notable if you recall my lecture from yesterday about the sometimes profound enmity, conflict between the Orthodox, especially the ultra-Orthodox, and the secular. Someone once said that the only thing that unites all the Jews in Israel is that they all hate the rabbinate. They all hate the establishment of the rabbis who control your life in so many different ways. So that orthodoxy is, if I can use the word with all the reservations necessary, the legitimate form of Judaism for most Israeli Jews. I recall once walking with a friend, noontime on Shabbat, when the synagogue's empty and people go home. My secular friend said, there go the Jews. In other words, that somehow the fact that we are not Orthodox makes us somehow less connected with the world that is Jewish. I'd like to give you another, for me, the most dramatic instance of orthodoxy being the default religion. A couple who are friends of ours, were celebrating the bat mitzvah, the 12-year-old girl's celebration, which, by the way, did not exist before the Second World War. It's part of the feminist revolution. It used to be only bar mitzvah. But they were celebrating a bat mitzvah for their daughter in a hotel. They organized the main hall to be a synagogue. But both of these were progressive Orthodox, but progressive gender equality Orthodox Jews, which is a very big movement in Israel today, the feminist equal rights between men and women in the synagogue. So that rather than have the women sit in the back, or on the sides, or in the balcony where they could barely see or hear anything, what they did was to take many potted plants, geraniums, photiuses, and ran them as a line in the middle of the synagogue, what used to be called a mechitza, the division between the men and the women. Everything went well until about an hour later, because then their secular friends came to the bat mitzvah in their cars. They weren't going to come at 8 o'clock in the morning, that's too early. So they came at 10. And they walked into the synagogue and immediately began to complain. A small mutiny took place because they said, this is not what a synagogue looks like. They even tried to move it so that the men and the women would be more clearly divided, partitioned into two parts. They failed, but it gives you an idea how even among the secular orthodoxy, and the orthodox form of the synagogue is the default position. Now, I want you to ask, what is the root of this very strange behavior? Why have the conservatives and the reform and the progressive forms of Judaism failed to spark an interest in Israeli society? Why, on the other hand, is Reform Judaism in America the largest single denomination? More than 30% of Americans define themselves as Reform Jews. In Israel, you can count them on a few fingers. There are about 25 conservative, reform, progressive, the name is not really important, synagogues in Israel. But 30 years ago, there were also 25. In other words, this is not a progress industry. It's not moving quickly at all. So why is their voice heard so rarely in Israeli public discourse? In fact, I can barely remember the last time a progressive conservative Jew made a strong statement in the newspaper. They're mostly silent. For most Israelis, I conclude, Reform Judaism is an alien presence. It doesn't belong here. It's awkward. It's dissonant. And as I said, it's alien. Now, the question that I've asked is much harder than what it originally sounds like, because the large majority of Israelis define themselves as non-Orthodox. About 45% say secular, the rest say traditional in varying degrees. But these are secular Jews that are different from secular Jews in other places. There was an Orthodox rabbi who said very painfully that the traditional, even secular Jews in Israel were really Reform Jews, and they didn't know it. The Reform Jews in America, as you know, do not accept all the strictures of not driving on the Shabbat or not using electricity on the Shabbat, and so on and so forth. They act pretty much the way secular Jews in Israel do. If you take the actual behavior of secular Jews in Israel, you will find that there is a remarkable overlap to that of Reform Jews in the United States. They pick and choose the events, the holidays that they want to observe. They reject the ones that are not terribly important to them. My son is celebrating his daughter's bat mitzvah by taking her on a family trip to Thailand. In other words, it is not the religion, it's part you do, everyone will celebrate the bat mitzvah, but not necessarily in a traditional way. So that these Israeli Jews are in many ways indistinguishable from their Reform colleagues, and yet they do not speak of themselves as Reform. They are not interested in the Reform. For them, Judaism means orthodoxy. Excuse my pace, because I am just... the more traditional among Israeli Jews, not religious, but more traditional, will act exactly the way the Reform Jews. They will say, go to the synagogue in the morning, and in the afternoon go to the beach, or go to a football game, or take a hike in the desert. Not things that fit together in the Orthodox Jewish world. Some may send their children to religious schools, but the practice at home is not orthodox. They use the sociological word construct their religious practice rather than accepting it fully from the halakha, the Jewish law. Even those life cycle events, birth, marriage, death, etc., Passover seders, the mezuzah on the door, and of course, circumcision are practiced by everyone, or virtually everyone. I've heard in my life of one mother who refused to circumcise her son, but did it 5 years later, when they went out with the other boys in the yard, and they looked, hey, you're different than we are, and the mother, of course, did not want that extra pressure on the child. There is only a small group, less than 10%, who actually define themselves as anti-religious. But even here, the strangest things happen, because these anti-religious people will nevertheless have a Passover Seder. Okay, they won't read the book, they won't do all the mitzvot that are necessary, but the Passover Seder seems to have transcended its religious meaning and to have become something of a cultural mark. When I will say, for example, that Israel is going to have its next election in March, April, I will say, naturally, Pesach time, Passover time. And the same is true of the high holy days and the rest, where those are the things that define the year. More and more, this may interest you, Novigod has become something of a ceremony in Israel too, of course, without any of its religious connotations, but basically in order to have a reason to throw a party. And Novigod, Sylvester, and the rest have integrated into Israeli life. It is interesting that circumcision, for example, or the mezuzah on the door, which, if my general estimation is right, is about 80%. When you walk through an apartment house, 80% or more will have a mezuzah. And 99% will circumcise their children. The well-known joke is that if circumcision was made into a law by the rabbinate, the number of those who would circumcise their children would be dropped by half. It's the fact that it is the natural thing that in the Jewish people, children are circumcised. So, I return to the first question. Why has Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism, not taken root in Israel. And for people all over the world, the same question is being asked. The obvious answer for preserving a Jewish identity and at the same time being modern and integrated into society would be some form of Reform Judaism. In America, this is true, but in Israel, it is not. Why then doesn't Reform Judaism make any substantial headway among Israeli Jews? First of all, Reform Judaism, as I noted, has a very strange origin. It came after Napoleon, who is said to have said, "I will give everything for Jews as individuals, but nothing for Jews as a nation." This idea of the Jews not being a nation, not forming a kind of cultural group, stems back to the Reform movement. In fact, the Reform movement in the early days of Zionism fought it tooth and nail. They argued in many ways similar and opposite to the Haredi that we discussed the other day, that Judaism is religion and not nationality, and Reform Judaism in Israel doesn't really work. Reform Judaism therefore began with a strange character that was an anti-nationalist and anti-Zionist, and there are still many lingering memories of the opposition between progressive Judaism, as it was then called, and Orthodox Judaism on the other hand. It goes even further. The German Reform, of course, did not remain there, but moved across the ocean to the United States. And Reform Judaism became a specifically American phenomenon. Praying in English, I mentioned organs, choirs, rabbis who wore Cossack, almost like a Christian priest. And it too never fit into the Israeli mentality. Very few Reform Jews, until after the Second World War, had any part in the Zionist movement. So again, it was sensed that these Reform, Germanized, Americanized Reform Jews had nothing to do with the huddled masses of East Europe, who were very open to the Zionist message. It began to be thought in Israel that Reform Judaism was awkward, problematic, not really part of Israeli Jewish culture. The synagogue that I don't go to is the Orthodox one. Another reason is probably the most obvious, that control over many different parts of life cycle events are under ultra-Orthodox dominance, which means that for many Jews, reformism, which the ultra-Orthodox totally reject, give them no money, do not allow them places to build their synagogues, do not recognize the marriages that their rabbis or their conversions and so on. Because of the great pressure of the rabbinate against Reform Jews, reformism has not dug in its heels and made a deep impress in Jewish society. One important political leader said he went to the synagogue, but he didn't understand all these popular modern Israeli songs being sung in the middle of prayer. He didn't understand why Hebrew poetry that had nothing to do with the classical liturgy was being sung in the shul. There is another, a very important element which we talked about in terms of the Russians on our first day, and that is the question of who is a Jew. It is the rabbinate, usually the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, that decides who is and who is not a Jew. It also controls all the ceremonies connected with life cycle events. I will give just one example. Before getting married, a young woman, in order to be available to her husband, must go to a ritual bath and, well, wipe the impurities off herself. She has to dunk 3 times under the water, saying a few blessings. Thank God now they no longer have rabbis watching. Now, again, this progressive feminist movement, they have these very large robes that are nowhere near the skin, so they do not prevent the water from touching the skin. So they are entirely modest, and they dunk into the water. Let me tell you the story of a family member, which will give a clear example of this conflict, this friction between Orthodox rabbinical Jews and others. My son and his wife were having trouble getting pregnant. Many times, many IVFs, nothing worked. So they decided to adopt a child from St. Petersburg. There are orphan homes in St. Petersburg. Let's adopt the girl. So they went to St. Petersburg, orphanage number 17, I remember, and they met this delightful, blonde, beautiful young girl, and they fell in love with her, and she responded, and they decided that they were going to adopt her. They came back to Israel, and they knew this before, but I forget her original Russian name, Maria Trampalova or whatever, was not Jewish. What were they going to do? Interestingly, Reform conversion doesn't count. It has no effect in law. They are not Reformed reformly converted people do not have a status of a Jew. So they thought, well, let's do something more conservative, not quite reform, but more conservative. But then they learned also that a child who is converted in a conservative way can no longer ever be converted in an Orthodox way. So they struggled, that's a very mild word, they fought tooth and nail about what to do with their lovely little daughter, Gili in Hebrew. She doesn't know, she knows she's adopted from Russia, but she doesn't know her name is Maria, whatever it is. We have her baptism document. In the end, my son won, not because he's any more religious than his wife, but because he said, let's avoid problems now when they start. What happens if she's 20 years old and she meets a guy for whom, or her mother, or his mother, or father, or grandfather says it's impossible that someone not Jewish be in our family, and insist on this little girl being Jewish. This shows why many, many people don't have a good word for the rabbinate. My son, as part of the conversion process, went to a liberal Orthodox rabbi whom I found in all kinds of strange ways. He went to synagogue 3-4 times, came then before a panel of ultra-Orthodox judges, and he, being a copywriter in advertising, knows exactly what to say, what wins. Oh yes, we are trying, we are fighting and all that, because in order for a conversion to work, at least officially, the family needs then to live a Jewish life. A religious Jewish life. So what they did, if there is such a thing as corruption, this is it. They insisted, the rabbis, that their daughter be signed up for a religious school, which was necessary. So she signed up for a religious school. They came with the certificate that she was accepted into this religious school, then tore it up and registered her in a secular school. So far the rabbis haven't caught up, but this shows how inconsistent and confusing this can all be. The power of the rabbinate in Israel is far, far beyond their proportion of the population. I mentioned marriages. The same is true of divorces. And in divorce, at least according to strict halakha, it is the man who gives the woman a divorce, and not vice versa. So that if a man is a son of a bitch and doesn't want to give his wife a divorce paper, he can fundamentally leave her nowhere. Married, cannot be remarried, and nevertheless, he, the husband, is feeling vindication every second. Kashrut, food being kosher, is controlled by the chief rabbinate, which is controlled by the ultra-Orthodox. And kashrut not only means that food is in fact kosher, it means much more than that. It means, does this restaurant open on the weekends? If it does, if it's open on Shabbat, then ipso facto, it is not given a conservative, a religious rabbinate certification. But all this is sort of dancing around the central issue. Perhaps the most basic reason is that the existence of a Jewish state with an enveloping Jewish culture precludes the need to seek out Jewish alternatives with which to identify. In the United States, for example, where being Jewish is almost always, usually, a question of being part of some form of religious community, people who come to America, friends, academics, secular Jews, come to, as I did, University of San Diego of California. And I wondered, how are we going to keep up some form of Jewish connection while we were there for a sabbatical for a full year? The only possible answer was to go to the synagogue. There are no other ways to be Jewishly affiliated, except for certain organizations, but broadly speaking, there are no ways of affiliating Jewishly without being religious. So here you have profoundly anti-religious Israelis who come to America, find that they want to keep up a certain tie with the Jewish people, but can do that only if they connect with some Jewish organization, religious organization usually. Hebrew is the spoken language. Sometimes for me it's extremely unusual to hear my grandchildren speaking Hebrew interspersed with biblical phrases, because biblical Hebrew has become part of modern Hebrew. You would need a scholar to tell where this sentence comes from in the Talmud or the Bible or whatever, but everybody uses them. Another example that has to do with business more, when end of August comes, and it's just before the days of what are called the high holy days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, the standard response, if you're looking for a job, if you want information about medical treatment, etc., will be in Hebrew, Achrei Chagim, after the holidays are over. The holidays, the Jewish holidays, they may not go to the synagogue, they may not care about Rosh Hashanah, they may not care about the fast, the festival of Sukkot, but Achrei Chagim has become almost a coin of speech in Israeli company, in Israeli life. One can hardly watch a news program without feeling that Jewish culture, sometimes ancient culture, even Aramaic culture, is fitting in to modern spoken Hebrew. You asked me yesterday what the name of this group in Jerusalem. The name the Turi Karta is not Hebrew.
Yes,
it's Aramaic.
It's very clear.
It's Aramaic. Israeli culture, as a result, is dense, is thick with Jewishness, whether you want it or not. If the electrician is coming and you took down a protocol of what was said between you as the homeowner and the electrician, odds are there would be 4 or 5 places in which either biblical or Talmudic or traditional historical began, that were found present. One interesting example that I like to tell, because it is so unusual for Israel, is the rebirth of the language of Hebrew. Jesus Christ was not, his mother tongue was not Hebrew, but it was Aramaic. At that time, more or less, Hebrew was declining as a spoken language, although Jesus spoke Hebrew well, and he was a scholar in Jewish schools and so on. Roughly about the year 2070, which is the year where the Roman armies entered into Israel and destroyed Jerusalem, roughly about that time, Hebrew is no longer a spoken language. Hebrew lives an underground existence. Existence in prayer, in scholarship, in liturgical poetry, but no one spoke the language. I was once on a trip to northern Greece, Macedonia, and our guide was a scholar of ancient Greek. So I asked him if you would pick up Plato's Republic and try to read it today as a Greek speaker, how far would you get? He said, nowhere. There would be virtually no words, or here and there a word that you could sort of make out. But Greeks had undergone the evolution of being a spoken language in Rome, Byzantine, Middle Ages, Ottoman Empire, etc., etc. And today's Greek has very little to do with ancient Greek. It's a scholarly field. On the other hand, Hebrew was very lucky. About the year 1000, more or less, Hebrew ceases to be a spoken language. It becomes language of Talmud and of literature, liturgy, etc., but no one spoke it. When two people came together from different parts of Europe, more likely they were to speak Languedoc or Occitan or whatever the language was, but certainly not Hebrew. And then this extraordinary thing happens. I don't believe there are many other precedents or equal. A man, a single individual. His name was Eliezer ben Yehuda. Decides that his son was going to be the first Hebrew-speaking child for 2,000 years. He had terrible problems. His friends didn't speak Hebrew. His wife spoke Russian often, but he began to make for the rebirth of Hebrew as a language. And of course, this Hebrew that he created was a polyglot mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic and scholarly Hebrew and Arabic. In fact, one of the great scholars of the Talmud, occasionally when there was a doubt about what a word meant, would gloss. In French, it's this. He would give the French word for the Hebrew. Now, if Hebrew was born anew, there were signs in buses that said, Ivri, daber Ivrit. Hebrew, Jew, speak Hebrew. And that began to roll the ball forward until today, where Israel has words, obviously not biblical, for jet planes or digital computer things and scientific laboratories, all words that were made up. And as a result, Hebrew became a repository of deep Hebrew culture, of deep Israeli Jewish culture. In fact, sometimes it happens that when Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews fight, they will use the same traditional phrases, each one interpreting in a different way. What time is it? What time are we supposed to end today?
We actually can finish a little bit later, like about 6:05.
Okay, all right, I just wanted to, what's more important than that? In America, because Judaism is mostly religious, American religion tends to be very adapting. They want to be part American, they want to be part Jewish, and as a result, Reform Judaism does all kinds of things that were unthinkable 100 years ago. They are in the forefront of the fight against homophobia, the forefront of the fight against racism of immigration, and so on. So in this way, they take a biblical phrase, justice shall ye pursue, classical Jewish phrase, or all people are created in the image of God, and use that very same phrase to push ideas that are anti-homophobic and immigration. Okay. Now, who make up these traditional Jews who are somewhat like Reform Jews in America? In Israel. Who are these Orthodox, sorry, once again, my head is not screwed on right today. Who are these traditional Jews? What makes them very different from Reform Jews, despite the similarity between them in terms of observance, is the fact that Reform Jews, an American phenomenon, tend to be liberal, even super liberal in their points of view. Traditional Jews, by contrast, in Israel, tend to be right-wing because they draw upon orthodoxy as the default religion, as I mentioned just a moment ago. I'm going to stop in a moment because my stomach is churning. I mentioned, well, I won't do it again because I think I mentioned it in the past. Traditional Jews in Israel are, as I mentioned the other day, largely Sephardic in origin. Overwhelmingly, I would say 75% of Sephardic Jews will define themselves as traditional. Ashkenazi Jews will not. They will speak of themselves as secular. But this means some very strange sociological phenomena. If you have a family of Ashkenazi Jews, some of whom are Orthodox, others ultra-Orthodox, others secular, this family will almost invariably split apart. There will not be any glue holding them together. Remember, I spoke yesterday of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, and the way this set these two communities against each other. On the other hand, when you have traditional Jews in the Sephardic type, there can be families that will be partially ultra-Orthodox, partially Orthodox, partially traditional, partially secular, and they will stay together. There's much less of this tension between the religious and the non-religious as there is in Orthodoxy. Would you mind if I would stop now? I just don't feel well. I'm sorry.